How you doing?
Okay, good. Thank God.
Good.
Okay, coming up to 1 o'clock. I'll share the screen in a moment and get started. How's everything?
Yeah, well, good. Just cold. What's it like
Ah,
in Cape Town?
yeah, mild. No complaints.
Really?
I heard up in Joburg it's getting pretty cold there.
Yeah, no, it is cold. And
No, you
I've
can't.
just heard they've announced load shedding level 4. Just
Crazy.
don't know what to
Yeah, I looked
say.
at the schedule actually. Thank God. Oh, yeah, it looks like we'll have between 4 and 6 this afternoon. It's crazy.
Yeah,
The one positive thing is very often City of Cape Town is one stage lower.
yeah,
So when national is stage 4, we only stage 3. Like today
yeah,
it's stage 2, we were stage 1.
yeah.
I don't know, but once it goes to stage 4, I don't know. It's complicated. We'll see if we can get out of that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Rabbi, don't tell them that. They want to come here, and then, you know.
We welcome them. I encourage anybody who wants to come out. Hey, listen, immigration over immigration, right?
Yeah.
Why not? Let's bolster our Cape community. This is live on YouTube. I might get in trouble here.
How you can't.
All right, thanks, John.
Yeah, listen. It certainly adds a spoke in the wheels. This and it affects people really small businesses and things like that to make it function. It's a big challenge we have to get over. But we still live in a blessed country, I think. And there's lots to be positive about.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, I'm gonna share the screen and we'll get started. Today's chapter is a little bit longer than last week's chapter, but I hope we'll manage it within the half hour. And it speaks about the vows of a minor or of a female who may be still under the jurisdiction of a father or a husband. And we'll look at some of those details. We're going to refer to some definitions of age, childhood, and adulthood that we've dealt with previously in other halachot, so we should be somewhat familiar with it, and it will be relevant in these laws as well. Okay, so I'm just going to face away because I'm looking at this screen here, but we'll begin chapter 11, first halakha. The following rule applies with regard to a male minor who is 12 years and 1 day old. Just to be, what is 12 years and 1 day old means that he's now in his 13th year, or a female minor who's 11 years and 1 day old, which means she's now in her 12th year, right? 13 and 1 day, they're going to be considered adult, or in the case of a female, of a girl, 12 and 1 day into her 13th year, she's going to be adult. But that year prior, in the male's 13th year or in the female's 12th year, and if they took an oath or a vow, whether a vow forbidding something to them or a vow consecrating an article, making something hekdesh, sanctified, we investigate them. See, here's the thing. Basically, what we're saying is that it's possible that their vow will be binding. We investigate them and ask them questions. If they know for whose sake they took the vow, they appreciate the severity of saying something in the name of God, making this commitment, or for whose sake they consecrated the article or took the oath, their vows and the consecrations are binding. If they do not know, their vows and their statements are of no consequence. So if we can ascertain that they have enough of a maturity and understanding about the severity of their word and the implication of swearing in the name of Hashem, and we are comfortable that they understand that, then their word is absolutely binding. It's necessary to make an investigation throughout the entire 12th year for a female and the entire 13th year of a male. What does that mean? So as Rambam says in Halacha 2, if a minor took a vow or consecrated a property at the beginning of the year they were questioned, it was discovered that they knew for whose sake the vow was taken. So at the beginning of the year, they said, I'm dedicating this cow to the Beit HaMikdash. And it was confirmed after investigating that they had indeed understood what they were saying, right? So the vow was maintained. But now if they took another vow later on in that year, they need to be questioned again in order for that to be maintained. We don't say that since at the beginning they were considered to be knowledgeable, then now it lasts throughout the year. The point is like this, is that even if we ascertain a certain level of maturity within that year, we still suspect that their maturity might be somewhat flaky. So for each commitment that they make, each neder or each shavua that they make, they need to be questions to ascertain that they understood exactly what their commitment was. So this again is for a male during his 13th year. That means from 12 years old in one day. And for a female during her 12th year, that's from 11 years old in one day. But before this time, meaning if they're younger, they're younger than 12, younger than 11, or younger than 12. Even when they say, we know for whose sake we took the vow and for whose sake we consecrated, their vows and consecrations are of no consequence. Okay? So even if an 11-year-old boy says, I'm making a vow, I'm never going to, in the name of Hashem, I'm never going to do such and such, or whatever it might be. And you say, are you sure? Do you know what you're talking about? And he says, absolutely, I understand. Nonetheless, it's of no consequence. That's a full minor, katan, no consequence. They're not held to that. But after this time passes, meaning once a boy is 13 years in one day, they've now celebrated the bar mitzvah, or a girl who's 12 years old in one day, they now celebrated the bar mitzvah. Even though they say we do not know for whose sake we took the vow, for whose sake we consecrated it, they cannot now claim that they don't understand. Their vows and their consecrations are binding, even though, and this is true, even if they did not manifest physical signs of maturity. This is the time when vows take effect, which is mentioned in all sources. What the Rambam is saying over here is you might remember that when we previously spoke about the definition of adulthood. So there's the age, and then there's also physical maturation. What the Rambam is saying is for the purpose of Nadarim, there's two things he's clarifying. That in the year leading up to the bar bat mitzvah, meaning in the 12th year of life for the male, or the 11th year of life for the female, their vows are binding under investigation. From 12 years for a girl and from 13 years on for a boy, their vows are binding, irrespective if they deny their appreciation and understanding for it. And more importantly, even if they have not yet shown physical signs of maturity. For certain laws, they would have to be that age plus have signs of maturity. For these laws, you just have to reach that age. Okay? Now, he explains. Since they reach the age of majority, for a girl 12 years old, boy 13, their vows are binding, even if they did not manifest physical signs of majority, and thus are not considered as adults with regard to all matters, as we just explained. This concept is of a scriptural origin. Sorry. That when a person close to the age of adulthood utters a vow, his consecrations of article and his vows are binding. Nevertheless, but there is a proviso. Nevertheless, although the vows of these individuals are binding, it knows they have to follow through on what they've made their commitment to. If they desecrate their vows or take oaths and substitute for them, they're not punished by lashes until they reach the age of majority and manifest signs of physical maturity. Okay, so that's when you would apply the full definition of adulthood for culpability. Their words would be binding. They would not be able to do what they said they're not going to do. But if they did, they wouldn't be punished for it unless they were both of age and had the physical signs of maturity. If such a minor consecrated an article and an adult came and benefited from the article that he consecrated, the adult is liable for lashes. So in other words, when we said an Eder, certain Nadarim vows are certain vows of abstention for myself or vows of consecration. I vow that this will be designated to the temple. Now, something that is inconsecrated, nobody's allowed to take personal benefit from. So although it was consecrated by the word of a partial minor, and if they benefited from it, they would not be liable for punishment. But if an adult used it for their personal benefit, they would be liable. For the minor's vows are valid according to scriptural law, as explained. The commitment is committed, they just won't be punished. But an adult who uses something that has been set aside by a minor, because that commitment's a commitment, they would be liable for whatever punishment might apply for their transgression. Halacha 6, when does the above statement that the vows taken by a female 12 years and 1 day old are binding, when does this apply? When she's neither in her father's domain or her husband's domain. Okay, and what we'll see over here is you'll remember that there's another designation amongst a young lady, that from the age of 12 to 12 and a half, she's an in-between stage. It's a na'ara. She's no longer a child. Now, even though she's reached 12, but she's no longer a full adult. So during that period, from 12 to 12 and a half, she is still considered dependent completely on the father. And there's a special mitzvah that allows a father to undo a vow that she makes. Similarly, a married woman. And in the next chapter, we'll learn about what the conditions there are, what the nature of a vow has to be. But a married woman, there are certain things which her husband can undo to do her vows or commitments. Okay, so again, so when we say if a girl is 12 years and 1 day old, up until she's 12 and a half, her vows are completely binding on her so long as there's nobody else to undo that vow, right? If ever she is in her father's domain, even if she comes of age and she is a maiden, her father may nullify all of the vows and oaths she takes on the day he hears them. This is a very important condition which needs to be borne in mind, that whenever a husband or a father, within the framework where they would be allowed to undo the vow, it must be on the day that they hear the vow. Once that day passes, it's considered as if they've conceded, they can no longer backtrack on it. That's just something to keep in mind as we read through these halachot and further halachot as well. As the pasuk says, all her vows and prohibitions shall not stand because her father withheld her. Okay, halacha 7. Until when may her father nullify her vows? Until she fully comes of age. Once she fully comes of age, he may not nullify her vows. Instead, all of her vows and oaths are like those of a widow or divorcee, as implied by everything that she forbade upon her soul shall remain upon her. This is when she's 12 and a half. Now she's completely an independent adult. She's also not married, so she's no longer dependent on her father from this perspective. She's not married. She is just like a completely independent woman, and that's when her vows will be fully upheld without anybody else having the opportunity to undo those vows. Halacha 8. When may a husband nullify his wife's vows and oaths? From the time she enters the chuppah. So this, what we're going to learn is there's absolute times and then there's questionable times. Basically, you'll remember that there's 2 stages in marriage. There's erusin and then there's nisuin. Erusin, which we loosely translate as engagement, is not like today's engagements. It's actually considered marriage. Just that in practice, in ancient times, the bride would not move in with her husband. Once they go through chuppah, then they move in, that's considered fully married. Okay, so when we say that a husband can, within certain circumstances, which we'll learn about tomorrow, nullify his wife's vows, that is specifically once they've gone through the process of nisuim, the full marriage, not just erusin. And that's the point that he's making up here. He may continue to nullify her vows forever until he divorces her, with the bill of divorce reaching her hand. So long as they're married from nisuim, unless obviously passes away or there's a divorce, he can nullify. And again, we'll learn about what types of vows he can nullify. Because when it comes to the father, he can nullify any type of vow, whether it affects him directly or not. When it comes to the husband, we'll see it has to be the type of vow that will ultimately affect him. If there is an unresolved doubt concerning a divorce, so there's certain situations where a divorce was handed, it's uncertain if she's actually received it. So there's a doubt. Are they married or not married? He should not nullify her vows. Okay, the point is like this, as we'll see from the next thing, is once he's initiated a divorce proceeding, even if we're not certain that it's taken hold, he's indicated that he's disassociating from her. So the only reason why a husband has the capacity to nullify a vow is because it may affect him. Once he's shown that he's disassociating from his wife, he no longer has that ability to change vows. And we'll see that detail in some of the other details of the halacha. He says as follows: if he gives her a bill of divorce conditionally, or one that takes effect at a later time. In other words, they'll only be divorced when such and such a condition is full, or they'll only be divorced once so many days pass. So they're not yet divorced, but he's made his intentions clear. Similarly, in that situation, shall not nullify her vows in the interim. Similarly, when a woman has heard that her husband died and remarried, but in truth her husband was alive, or other similar situations prevail, neither her first husband nor her second husband should nullify her vows. Why? Because the law is going to insist that she has to separate from both of them. It's an unusual situation. She heard that her husband died, she went and got married. That means that her new husband is illegitimate, but because she's now had extramarital relations with another man, she's no longer allowed to be with her original husband. She has to separate from both of them. And because practically will be divorcing or separating from both of them, neither of them have any sway over her vows that she takes. If she was forbidden to her husband by a negative commandment, and needless to say, if she was forbidden only by a positive commandment and her husband nullified her vows are nullified. There's 2 types of marriages or relationships that a person come in. We learned this previously, so it's just a reference over here. Sometimes there's a negative command that doesn't allow you to be married. Sometimes because of a positive command, one is not allowed to be married. Like a Kohen cannot be married to a divorcee. Now, that's a lesser kind of. Sorry, I'm getting confused at the moment. But the point is, there's certain types of marriage which you outright says you're not allowed to marry. Others, because of the positive conditions that you need in a marriage, are not there. Either way, it's a marriage that should not be. If her husband does nullify her vows, her vows will be nullified because they are in that relationship, even if they should not be in that relationship. Halacha 9, when a maiden, okay, this is somebody a girl between 12 and 12 and a half, right, has been consecrated. So between 12 and 12 and a half, we said that her father has dominion over this because she's dependent on her father still. But if during that period she gets engaged, and again, engagement not in our terms, but in the terms of halacha, that's an actual first stage of marriage. So now she is concerned, she's called a naira ma'orasa, an engaged or a consecrated maiden. And now, if she makes a vow or an oath, both her father and her spouse-to-be are able to nullify the vow, but they must do it together. Both of them have to do it. If one nullified the vow alone, it is not nullified. If her arus nullified the vow alone, and she violated the vow before her father nullified it, she is not liable for lashes. Which means to say like this: although to be completely released of the vow, she needs both her father and her what's the word I'm looking for? The proposed individual. If either one of them does nullify her vow, it does weaken the vow to the degree that she won't be punished for it, even though she should not be transgressing that vow. Halacha 10. If the aris dies, so she's 12, between 12 and 12 and a half, she's technically still under her father's influence, but she's now engaged. So she's still living in her father's house, but she's designated to this man in marriage, but not full marriage yet. And then he dies. Okay? But she made a vow during that period. So what happens? She now technically returns completely to her father's domain. Any vow she takes may be nullified by her father, as was her status before consecration. What happens if her father died after she was consecrated, meaning designated in marriage, and she took a vow after his death? Then her aris cannot nullify it. Because between 12 and 12 and a half, she's technically still under her father's dominion, but he's now no longer here to do a double nullification, the father and the husband-to-be. For an aris cannot nullify his wife's vows alone until she has entered the chuppah. So in that instance, she would be bound by that because there's no one to nullify. I mean, there's the husband, but he can't do it alone, the husband-to-be. And we're going to go through a number of these scenarios, try to keep our heads about us, but some of the principles are that during that period, because you need both, if you don't have both, you're not going to be able to nullify it. We'll see that sometimes the father has a little bit more, should we say, authority to be able to, like we learned previously, than the proposed husband. But ideally, you need both. And what we're going to learn is some interesting scenarios where if she gets re-engaged to another person after the one that she's proposed to marry to, then that new husband-to-be can actually nullify. And we'll see there's a difference between whether or not this arus died or divorced her. Because we'll see that if he divorced her, you might say that is actually a proclamation that he accepted her vow, and that's why he wants to be away from her. But if he died, we have to assume that he hasn't had a chance to go one way or another, and therefore we don't have his buy-in to it. The father would not be able to do it alone. Okay, those are just some pointers to keep in mind as we go through these scenarios. Halacha 11. The following rule applies when a consecrated maiden takes a vow. Her father heard her vow, but not her arus. She was divorced that day and then consecrated by another person on the same day. So there's her father heard about it, but did not do anything about it. But her proposed husband didn't even hear about it. But he divorces her in the morning. That afternoon, another guy proposes to her and she agrees to marry him. She says, even if this happens 100 times, obviously it's a very far-fetched, unusual scenario, but the Rambam is bringing it to make a point. So even if she was divorced and consecrated 100 times that day, her father in her last arus may nullify the vows she took before her first arus. Remember we said the vow must be nullified on the day that he heard about it. So the father heard about it at 8 o'clock in the morning. The first husband divorces her at 8:30, and somebody else proposes to her at 9 o'clock, right? And she accepts it. So then the father and that husband, so long as it's before sunset on that night, can nullify the vow. The rationale is that she never departed into her own domain for one moment. Right? For throughout the entire time she is in her father's domain, for she's still a maiden. So as long as she remains in her father's domain, and there's some other arus that can join together with the father, even if it's not the original arus, they together can nullify her vow. When, by contrast, a married woman took a vow and her husband did not nullify it, he divorced her. So this is someone who's gone through nisuin, the second thing. So once she's nasui, she's completely out of the domain of her father. Now she's divorced. So he divorced her that day and remarried her that day. He cannot nullify her vows, even if it's the same husband, because she's fully independent of anyone else's domain during the divorce, and now she's remarrying. Now he no longer has a say over what she accepted while she was independent of him. Well, after she departs into an independent domain after she took her vow. Although she took her vow in his domain, and she is now in his domain again because she got divorced and then remarried, since she departed into her own domain in interim, her vows are binding. Unlike the case in the previous halacha, where she was never completely independent of somebody else's domain, either the father or the arus. The following rule applies when a consecrated maiden took a vow that was not heard by either her father or her arus. So then she took the vow, but neither of them have heard about it. Now she was divorced and then consecrated to someone else. Even several days after she took the vow, when her father and her newest arus the last arus hear about the vow that she took while consecrated to her first arus, they may nullify it since her first arus did not hear it. So if he hadn't heard it, so now the new one can be the one to nullify it. The following rule applies when a consecrated maiden took a vow. Her father alone heard it and nullified it, but then the man to whom she was consecrated died before hearing it. If she was consecrated to another man or to 100 other men that day, her father and her last arus may nullify her vow, which is actually what it affirms what we learned before. The father actually nullified it. Before we said even if the father hadn't nullified it and there's now a new husband, together they can nullify it. So it's along the same lines at that, because she's never completely out of the domain, are fully independent, and the two now together can nullify it, as we've said. If she's a Nara Amarasa, she's a Nara, she's a maiden between 12 and 12 and a half, and she's also betrothed to a man, together they can nullify it. The following rule applies when the Iris heard her vow, nullified it, and died afterwards. Okay, so he nullified it and died. Now her father heard it and was consecrated to another person that day. The father and the second Iris may nullify her vows, so long as it's still the same day, right? They can still do it on the same day. But if her father heard that she took a vow, but the Iris did not, and the Iris died that day, or the Iris also heard about her vow and nullified it, or remained silent, and then died that day, she returns to her father's domain, and her father may nullify her vows. He can do it alone, because she now returns basically to her father's domain. And the fact that he's out of the picture because of he's passed on, it's no affirmation or the opposite, or nullification of the vow. But if the Iris heard about the vow and maintained it, if he confirmed it, he says, okay, he's happy with her maintaining the vow, and then he does, and he remains silent and died the following day. So it was the next day, meaning he knew about it, but he didn't protest it. Her father can no longer nullify it, because now her father's doing this alone. In other words, so long as the father and the Iris were both responsible, so to speak, for her, there was no indication one way or another. And now the Iris dies, and the father, she returns fully to her father's domain, he can nullify it on his own. However, let's see, if the Iris divorced her, and in Halacha 17, if the Iris divorces her after hearing about her vow, so we have this unresolved question whether the divorce is considered as silence, and her father may nullify the vow, like we learned in the previous Halacha when he passes away. With the second Iris, she's now concentrated. Or perhaps do we define the divorce as him almost maintaining the vow? We can say that maybe the reason he might have said, you know what, I'm fed up with this lady that keeps taking these vows that are impossible. You know what, you keep your vow and I'm getting out this marriage. It may be considered as an affirmation. And then the father, so in that instance, the vow is maintained. So there's a doubt whether or not the father can actually go ahead and nullify it with a new Arus. When the father heard the vow and nullified it and then died, and then the Iris heard of the vow, or even if the Iris heard of the vow before the death of the father, she is not transferred entirely to the domain of her Iris, right? The proposed, because it's only Eris and it's not Nisuin. So he cannot ever nullify the vow after the father's death. If the father's not there that they do it together, nullify the vow, he has no other option. For an Iris can nullify for an aris can nullify a vow only together with the father. Again, so what we've seen is there's sometimes that the father, once the arus is out of the picture, can nullify on his own or together with another arus. But if the father's the one that died, the arus will never have an opportunity to nullify this betrothed vow. If the arus heard the vow, nullified it, and died, and then the father heard, or the father heard and nullified it, and the arus died before he heard it, the father cannot nullify these vows that were in the jurisdiction of the first arus, except together with a second arus, whom she has consecrated that day, as we explained. Again, we spoke about this. We need an arus together with the father to nullify it, and it must also be on the same day. Halacha 20, if a woman took a vow, her father nullified it alone, and her husband did not hear of the vow until he brought her into his domain. In other words, now not while she was an arus, just betrothed, they now fully married, he cannot nullify her vow. Now that they're married, he's no longer a co-signer on a nullification. He's now a husband. The relationship is different. She's no longer under the dominion of her father at all. She's now completely in his domain. If for a husband cannot nullify a vow taken by the woman, he consecrated after he marries her. In other words, at the point of marriage, any vow that is binding on her remains binding. Okay? And because prior to the marriage, the only way they could have nullified it was together, if he missed that opportunity, even if the father had nullified it, it's not fully nullified and it remains in place for this woman. So instead, this must be done before she enters the domain, when he nullifies it together with her father. And that's what should have been done. Should have nullified it together with his father. So he says, for this reason, the Rambam writes, it was the practice of Torah sages to tell their daughters before they left their domain, all the vows which you took while in my household are nullified. Okay? So that the father's done his bit. Similarly, the husband would tell her before she enters the domain, all of the vows that you took from the time I consecrated you until you entered my home are nullified. Because again, when does the father or the husband have one day to nullify the vow? When they know about it. They must nullify it on the day they know about it. If they allow the day to pass, the assumption is that they've accepted it. They can no longer nullify it. But what is if the arus took a vow that they're not, this arusa took the vow that they're not familiar with? So they can make a blanket statement. And that's why he's saying the father would make a blanket statement. Any vows that you took while you were an arusa, you are freed from. And the husband to be would say the same thing. For the husband can nullify vows of his wife, even though he did not hear them. Okay. And that way they would be clean. So they go into the marriage, there's no baggage that will affect the husband now from vows that she'd taken prior to the marriage. Halacha 22. If the father went with the agents of the husband. Okay, so now we're going to define at what point does this daughter move to the husband's domain completely out of the father's domain. Okay. Clearly, if there's an actual chuppah, that will be the moment. But what happens if there's an interim period where she's no longer in the father's house, but she's also not yet in the chuppah? So at what point does she move out of her father's domain into the husband's domain? So in a scenario, for example, if the father went with the agents of the husband, so yeah, this time we're talking about a case where the husband is not there himself, but he sends shluchim to come and accept the woman, bring him to her domain. So if the father went with the agents of the husband, or the father's agents went with the agents of the husband, her vows must still be nullified by her father and her husband jointly. In other words, so long as the father's representative is with the representative of the husband, or the father is together with the representative of the husband, she's not fully out of the father's domain yet. But if her father transferred it to the agent of her husband, or her father's agent transferred it to her husband's agents, her father can no longer nullify her vows. In other words, although she's not under the chuppah, but she's now is under the jurisdiction of the husband, it says he no longer has the power to oversee her vows. But at the same time, nor may the husband nullify them, because she's not fully in his domain yet. They haven't actually gone into the chuppah. For the husband cannot nullify vows that were taken before he married her, as explained. So that would be an interim period, and so long as the father has a nullified and he has a nullified, she'll go into the marriage with vows that she may have taken. Okay, 23. When the woman is waiting for yivum. So yivum is the levirate marriage, right? It's an unusual circumstance where a woman gets married to a man, they have no children, and Torah dictates that she must marry one of his brothers. Okay, so she's a woman kind of in waiting. It's similar to Erisin, but different to Erisin. He says, even if the Yavam already made a statement of his intent. So for example, if there's more than one brother, which brother will she marry? So one of them will have to make some type of statement of intent. even if there's only one brother, which is comparable to Kiddushin, that they're going to go ahead and marry her. Now, the only way that marriage can be consummated is through intimate relations. Unlike generally Nisuin can be with the chuppah and other things, here it must be with intimate relations. So in other words, there's some connection between this young lady and this man now, the brother of her deceased husband. And if there's only one Yavam and one Yavama, the Yavam may not nullify her vows until he is intimate with her. It's not like Kiddushin. He has no dominion over those vows, okay? Even though in others, what we're saying is there seems to be some similarity in the relationship. With regard to vows, he has no dominion over her. When a Yavama, so this is the woman who's lost her husband, who is a maiden, and she's only between the age of 12 and 12 and a half, and has been merely consecrated to a deceased husband, and her father is alive. So this is what happened. She's 12 years old. She's engaged to a man, first stage of marriage. Then he passes away. And now she's a Yavam, meaning she's attached to this man's brother. Her father is still alive. So the Yavam and her father do not nullify vows together. It's not like the Yavam is now considered to be engaged to her. Instead, her father alone is the one who nullifies any vows that she takes. Even if the Yavam stated his intent to marry her, she is not considered as a consecrated maiden to this Yavam. For a statement of intent does not establish a complete marriage bond between a Yavama and her Yavam. As we explained, only actual relations will consummate the marriage. There is no stage of Kiddushin or Eresin with a Yavam. When a maiden was given into marriage by her father, is widowed or divorced after marriage, she is like an orphan in her father's lifetime in the sense that he doesn't have halachic authority over her. Her father does not have the right to nullify vows, even if she is a maiden. So although she's in the age where she would have been under his dominion, because she's been married fully, she's gone through not just Eresin, but Nisuin, and now she no longer has a husband, either because of divorce or he passes away. She no longer goes back to her father's dominion. And that's where, and he would have no word or authority over her vows. Halacha 26, when a consecrated maiden takes a vow, but neither her father nor her husband heard of her vows until she came of age. Now she's beyond 12 and a half, or until she became like an orphan in her father's lifetime, like in the previous halacha. Her vows are binding, they cannot be nullified by her arus. The rationale is that she departed from her father's domain, and he and her arus may nullify her vows together, must nullify her vows together, and she has not entered her husband's domain. So in other words, so she's in our, so it's, as soon as she becomes a full adult, but she's no longer in her father's house, and she's also not fully into her husband's house, no one can nullify her vows, and her vows are binding. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 11. That's some technical, whole bunch of technical examples, but I hope we picked up on kind of the consistency of the rules. The principles that are going on over here when it comes to a young lady making vows when she's still dependent to